theory of asymmetrical dependency. It's clearly, you will see, not a conclusion, but more a start. For me, it's a kind of test run. I've never presented what I say today. I've never published about it. It's clearly a start of a work program and a research program, but I strongly believe in the power of social theory to structure the field for historical and empirical research, and that's at least a claim for the future, not for the test run I present today, but you will see. If one tries to work on a theory of asymmetrical dependency, one has first to register, as much as I know today, that there are no theories of asymmetrical dependencies. We are not in a situation, as much as I know, where we have some established theories, and I can come here and say that's the cluster of established theories, and I thought them today and say why I prefer this to other alternatives. That's not the situation we have. As much, I would say, until now there are no such theories. That's in itself interesting, because the topic is of so enormous importance for the history of human social systems, but I don't see essays to do such a thing. Of course, there is an enormous literature. You always have in science an enormous literature. It's disparate. It's distributed over many fields, and I've written some names here. There is Marcel Mauss, which theory of the gift I find interesting. There is Richard Emerson, very eminent, although not so well-known American sociologist who wrote about power-dependence relations. There is the German-American economist Albert Hirschman. There is very important James Coleman with his Foundations of Social Theory, one of the greatest books of the last 20 years, and some others. And I think you can take some things from these books and theories, and that's what and from some others, and that's what I will try to do today. First, what I do propose, if I may say it in these words, I dare to propose in the name of the Excellence Cluster 2, strong asymmetrical relations are not what some Enlightenment thinkers may have thought a surprising error in the history of human social systems. That's clearly not the case. It's not an error, a failure of a humanity which always could have opted differently. That's clearly not the case. Asymmetrical dependencies are not an accidental error. They are instead a constitutive building block of all human social systems. Strong asymmetry is a very strong structure in all human social systems, and they have to be understood as such, not as a kind of misadvantage which could not have happened too. And then that's the proposal, and that's mainly the only point on which I will speak today. Then there is a kind of question at the end. There is modern society or modernity, and I think there is clearly a discontinuity. I only have to register this here, but more as a kind of horizon for very future work. There's clearly a discontinuity, because modern society is for the first time in human history built on a strong value preference for symmetrical social relation. But that's revolutionary, and that's a clear discontinuity. And we have never had this before. That's for the future work of the cluster and for my future work, but that's not my topic today. Does you can and will, and if why, and if not why, does modern society succeed with this unforeseen value preference. We have some simple core concepts on which most of what I will say today will be. There is first dependence, and then there is always the other side of dependence, and the terms of which I would think power. If you have a dependence, there will always be power, but you can call it control, or you can call it dominance. And for my usage today, these differences of dominance, power, control do not matter so much. I make use of them as near synonyms. And often, control is better than power, because if you, as many sociologists do, prefer to understand power as a specifically political concept, then control as a more general term who integrates many concepts which include power, then may be the better term. But that's, for me, it's not so important. It's what really interests me is this bifocality, dependence and the other side, which is called power or dominance or control. What is dependence? I've written down a definition by an American economist who was a very interesting analytical social scientist, Alfred Kuhn. It's old, 1974, but I think still true. A is dependent on B to the extent that communicational, transactional, or organizational relations between the two are advantages to A. The dependent person is dependent while there are advantages which accrue to him or her from the relations he or she has established to another person. And these relations are of a very diverse kind. They are communicational relations. They are transactional, that means they imply an exchange, or they are organizational, that means they are internal to an organization or to another macro entity. That's dependence. And if A is dependent on B, then, and that's in some respects the most important point in every theory of asymmetrical dependency, if A is dependent on B, then B clearly has power over A. That results from this. B has power, control, or dominance over A. And that's the elementary structure which you will find everywhere where you have dependencies. And you can write it in this very simple, so simple that you nearly would not call it a formalization. In this very simple formalization, Richard Emerson introduced PBA equals DAB. That means the power of B over A is exactly, one might add, equal to the dependence of A from B. And that's the most elementary equation which will help us to understand power-dependence relations. And if one starts in this way, there arises at once the next question, which is for us, for the excellence cluster, the most important question, because we do not work about dependencies, but we work about asymmetries. And many dependencies clearly are not asymmetrical, but what really interests us are asymmetrical dependencies. And one can, again, describe and note them in this very elementary formalization by Emerson. If it's true, if what I wrote down in the first line, if from power of A over B, it derives from the dependency of B on A. And if this implies that the power of A over B equals the power of B over A, and this is only true if A is as much dependent on B as B is dependent on A, and that's clearly often the case in social relations. Think of two organizations who do some deals with one another. Not always, but often. These are clearly symmetrical relations with symmetrical dependencies. As long as this is the case, we do not speak about asymmetrical, but about symmetrical dependencies. But the situation changes if the power of A over B is greater than the power of B over A, and this logically follows from the dependency of A on B being smaller than the dependency of B on A. That's the basic understanding which we need to understand how asymmetrical relations not emerge, but have to be described, how they are structured. And I think one can easily claim all of them are structured in this way. I have to add some more terms. There is interdependence, which is obviously as general as it is unproblematical in very respects. That's, one could claim, the stuff from which society is made. It's a potential and theory of society to say society mainly consists from interdependencies. Georg Simmel, in many respects, has thought and formulated in this way: society, global society, world society as a system of ever-extending interdependencies. There is mutual dependence, which is nearer to what interests us here. And then, mutual dependence in a first approximation is still symmetrical. And then we have power imbalance. And that is the point at which asymmetrical relations based in dependencies arise. And what I find interesting, and the point which has been made by most thinkers, researchers, theorists who thought about these things, is that you can formulate this relation of mutual dependence, symmetrical, power imbalance, asymmetrical, in two ways. You can say it's either the one or the other one is the case. Either you have mutual dependence or you have power imbalances. That's one way of formulating it. It's often correct, but more typical for human social relations and more typical for relations in human social systems is another way of structuring them. There are mostly mutual dependencies and power imbalances in the same relation, embedded into the same relation. You have often in social relations many aspects in which these relations are based in mutual dependencies, and then there are some aspects in which power imbalances arise. And at this point, at which power imbalances arise in situations which in other respects are based in mutual dependencies, we have the genesis of asymmetrical dependencies and asymmetrical relationships. And that's what really interests us, this equilibrium, this balancing between mutual dependencies and some power imbalances, and how they arise, and how they are built, and how they can be balanced in some respects, and then asymmetries may disappear again or may be weakened again. This is a core point on which I will speak later in this talk. But before I enter into this, I have to add one more analytical point which is very important as much as I see for our research, for our understanding. We have to interest us for the question, which objects are there which are controlled and by the control of which either symmetries or asymmetries arise. And I think there are mainly three objects of control of which social theory will have to think, and historical and empirical research will have to do research. There are first resources. And what I find remarkable, that most dependency theories I find, especially in organization theory, only speak about resources. Of course, that's a very important point in human societies, an unequal distribution of resources. And resources which are important for the one person, which are in the possession of another person, and from this unequal distribution of resources, inequalities arise. And in some respects, power imbalances arise, because it may be the case that the person who controls resources, which I would like to have, gets by this power over me. For example, if the resource is an economic good, it may be the case that the person who controls this good as his or her property can dictate prices to me, which are perhaps excessive, and this dictate of prices, which may be excessive, is clearly a power imbalance. But nonetheless, to me, this question of the control of resources is not the core of what interests us here. From unequal control of resources mainly do not arise those asymmetrical relationships in which we are mainly interested. But what arises from it is social inequality or economic inequality. And that's very important, but it's clearly something different than asymmetrical relationships in the understanding in which it is the core of this cluster. There is a second very interesting and very important object, which may be an object of control and from which asymmetrical relationships may arise. And this second object, and I find that remarkable, has seldom been theorized in theories about dependency, although it's probably the most important object of control for asymmetrical relationships about humans. And this object of control are actions. And that's what characterizes most of the social relations which interest us here. If you think of slavery, it's clearly a social relation in which the slaveholder is in a situation of control towards the slave, not primarily on the basis of control of resources, but mainly on the basis of control of actions. That's what a slaveholder is allowed and legitimate to control. He controls the actions of his slave. And that's a very interesting aspect, this distinction of resources and actions, as much as I see. The first social theorist who has really extensively theorized about this basic distinction of control over resources versus control over actions is James Coleman in Foundations of Social Theory. Therefore, it's a very important book for us. And I think that most of the asymmetrical dependencies which interest us here are forms of asymmetrical control which regard an asymmetrical control over the actions. And even if you, and therefore this subject is near to our interest, if you look about labor relations in contemporary society, somebody contracts a labor relation with somebody else. The core of this labor relation clearly is not the control of resources, but again the control of the action. That's what a an enterprise may demand from its employees they have in a specified amount, in a specified time, be available for actions which are contracted and which have to be done in the labor time they have contracted out. And therefore actions are very much in the core of what interests us here. There is a third interesting category which, as much as I see, has nearly never been mentioned in theories of dependencies, but it's a third very important aspect of control over relevant things which may generate asymmetrical dependencies, and that's experiences. That means the way I perceive the world. That's what one may call, Niklas Luhmann is a German sociologist who has very much theorized on this difference of action and experience. And one should not forget experience, because many aspects of social control have to do with the control of experience. That means with the control of the way a person is allowed to perceive the world. And it's obvious that this is a very important dimension of the social world, that often persons in dominant positions try to control the experience, the way of perceiving, of seeing the world, the experience of others. But again, I would say that's normally not the core of what the asymmetrical dependencies we are interested in do. Slavery is not about the control of experiences as much as I perceive. That's normally what is not expected from a slave, that he or she perceives the world in a certain understanding. That's, one could say, the major dimension in which a slave is free, not to accept, not to find his slavery wonderful, to think about the world in different terms than his master does. From him or her are only expected actions. The control of experiences is something different. It's very important, because especially in the 19th and 20th century world, we have immense experiences with totalitarianism. And that's again a very important structures of asymmetrical dependencies. That's what totalitarianism does, to expect that everybody sees the world in the same light. And when in our days China sends its Uyghur Muslim population to camps that are strong asymmetrical dependencies, but they are not about actions. It's not forced labor. There is some forced labor, but that's not the point what is important for China. It's about the control and the change and the socialization of ways of seeing the world, and that's something different. So much. I think that's important, and therefore I said some points about it. But now comes, and that's my last, and at the same time, as much as I understand my major points, if we see a theory of asymmetrical dependencies as a theory which theorizes power imbalances and theorizes mutual dependencies, and somehow the balancing of mutual dependencies, which are mostly symmetrical, and power imbalances, which are always asymmetrical. If that is the core of a theory of asymmetrical dependencies, this relation of mutual dependencies and power imbalances, then what becomes really interesting is the dynamics between power imbalances on the one side and mutual dependencies on the other side. And there are some dynamics or some operations by which this relation between power imbalances and mutual dependencies is modified, is shifted from the one to the other side. And that's my last point. It's the first list, which I only drew up in these days, but I was able to identify, it's only a test run, perhaps I will modify this list, but I think all of the 8 categories which I want to present are very interesting cases of operations which are important for balancing this relation of power, disbalances, and mutual dependencies. All these operations change the chance in asymmetrical dependencies to claim and to maintain power imbalances. And I will go through this list. I have written it on this, and now I will sketch and explain very briefly these 8 strategies or these 8 operations by which power imbalances are built up or somehow are weakened. Both may be, often they are. All these strategies may operate in both directions. They may strengthen, they may build up, they may extend power imbalances, or they may weaken power imbalances. First, withdrawal. That's a clear case. It has often been theorized. One can, in a situation of strong asymmetrical dependency, somehow make this dependency collapse. One can often do this by simply withdrawing from the situation. If I'm in a situation, if, for example, and that's an interesting case of strong asymmetrical dependency, if I love another person very much, and this love is not reciprocated, I'm clearly in a very important situation of strong asymmetrical dependencies, but I can change this situation by withdrawal. I can decide, or it may happen to me, that from today to tomorrow, this motivational orientation to another person collapses. And that's a kind of withdrawal. And the interesting consequence is there is no longer any asymmetrical dependency. You may be disposed to say that's not very relevant in social terms. I would not agree. But there are so many other forms of withdrawal. I will take another extreme example. Take a prisoner. For example, a political prisoner or any other prisoner whomsoever, who is in a very strong relation of asymmetrical dependencies, especially if this is a very restrictive situation, perhaps some torture or whatever is added to it. That's a very strong asymmetrical dependency. But what one often finds in our days, I think that's a strategy which only works in modern societies. If you say, now I stop eating, it's an interesting withdrawal strategy given to prisoners. You have, in a modern society, from 1 second to the next, a complete reversal of dependencies. The fear of the prisoner dying from his hunger strike is in many countries in the world. I would even dare to say nearly most countries. It's so strong that by this withdrawal, I say it doesn't matter any longer to me if I die. The strong asymmetrical dependencies is reversed. And we have a huge spectrum of withdrawal strategies. That's often, I only have to say the resource, the action does no longer matter to me, and that's clearly a withdrawal strategy. I only have to say I am now indifferent towards something which was so important to me yesterday. In all these cases of withdrawal, we have a clear inversion of asymmetrical dependencies. That's the first case. Second case, probably much more important in social systems, is the extension of a network. And the person who wants something from the other person has no third or fourth or fifth person from whom he or she might get the same resource or the same action. And this absence of alternatives is in many cases clearly the structure behind the power imbalance. And as soon as I succeed to find other persons or other groups from which I might get the same resource, as soon as I succeed to expand my network, the power imbalance clearly changes. And that's what actors typically do who live in situations of power imbalances. They look for alternatives. They look for alternative network addresses who might do the same thing they want. And as soon as they succeed, the power imbalances clearly decreases, and it's clearly the other way around if my network of relevant addresses shrinks. Therefore, that's a very important dimension. By extending my network, I diffuse dependencies. By a shrinking network, I'm in the situation in which my dependencies will probably increase. And one can illustrate this with many, many examples. For example, take education. As long as children are only educated by their parents, as long as there are no peers and there are no teachers and no other relevant social relations in other families, education is based on very strong asymmetrical dependencies between parents and children. By expanding the network, by peers, by other families, by teachers and other persons of reputation and standing, you clearly have a weakening of power imbalances. That's the second balancing operation I find very important, extension of network. And in many respects, one could say that's what social systems consist from, by shrinking of networks and power imbalances arise, and by extension of networks and power imbalances are weakened. Third point, coalition formation. That's a very basic strategy because it's at least as old as human social systems are. If you look at research on primates, comparative research on humans and the primates who are most clearly related to them, say chimpanzees and bonobos, there is one structure you find as well in chimpanzee as in bonobo as in human societies. There are always very strong animals, alpha males, one might call them. You have it in all three types of societies. They are strongest with chimpanzees and perhaps weakest in human societies. But in all three types of societies, you often observe coalitions of weaker animals. Often these weaker animals are only females. Sometimes they are coalitions of males and females. And always the very strong animals who succeeded to establish very strong power imbalances are counteracted by these coalitions of weaker animals. That's very elementary. That's somehow built into the biological infrastructure of human action. And it's clearly the case that this strategy of coalition formation is most often to be found in very early human systems, and that's the reason why human systems in many reasons are at the start more egalitarian than other primate society. And one perceives from this the relevance of this operation or this strategy of coalition formation. And then I start with very early societies, say 100,000, 200,000 years ago. But of course, beyond biological relevances, you still have, and of course, in most societies, in most social situations, this has nothing to do with biology, but coalition formation is one of the strongest strategies in building human societies. You transform person-person relations into relations of persons to groups. There is a person, it's a strong person. There are some other persons, relatively weak persons, who have to live with power imbalances, but as soon as these weaker persons build a group, power imbalances shift. And then you have group formation, and you have the formation of social systems, and it's clearly the basic structure of human society which arises from these group formation processes. And as long as there is a group, there is always a structure which makes it impossible for a very strong individual to hold to his or her strengths. And in groups arise all the other aspects which are characteristic of human societies. There are roads, that's not so important to us. In our interest here, there arise norms, that is very important, but because norms formed internal to groups may be norms which limit the playing field for asymmetrical dependencies, and from norms arises values, and from these structures arises the whole social world consisting from roles, norms, values, all of which are collective results, and all of which as collective results may restrict the power imbalances which are coupled to other groups, smaller groups, individuals. And that's the reason why coalition formation is such an important balancing operation in the control of power imbalances. That's the third type I want to mention. Then there is a fourth type, a force balancing operation, very closely related to coalition formation, and that is status attribution. And that's again a very interesting operation, of which I would say you again find this in all human societies. There are social relations, some of which are social relations into which are built strong power imbalances, and now the weak ones, who are the objects of these, who are controlled by these strong power imbalances, may decide to give to the strong person or to the strong group or to the strong estate status. And that's in some respects relatively cheap to give status, but in other respects it's often very important to strong persons, to persons who search for power imbalances. And by the attribution of status, there emerge such a thing as contractual obligations between the strong ones and the weak ones. And by this attribution of status, which in the first approximation seems to extend imbalances, in some respects these imbalances are weakened at the same time too. You can easily observe this in early modern European monarchies, in which this status attribution, luxury, pomp, status symbols are very much accrued by the monarchs. But at the same and the monarchs have all these status attributes in relation to the other persons in the social systems which are not yet citizens, but which are still subjects. And subject means you are subdued, you are not as important as the monarch and the other persons of honor and high social status. But this attribution of status clearly creates contractual obligations. And now arise such ideas which are everywhere in European early modern monarchies, that this monarch clearly is responsible for the common weal, for the welfare of all of his subjects. And that is somehow related to this strategy of status attribution as a kind of interaction between the powerful and those who are the object of these power imbalances. I have 4 more balancing operations, and as I already spent a considerable amount of time, I have to be brief, but I think they are easily understandable, and therefore it may be sufficient to sketch them with only some words. There is a 5th one, which is clearly related to the work of Hirschman, who invented this theory of voice, although it's a theory about something about which every one of us knows much, but it wasn't there as a theory before Albert Hirschman. Voice means that in power asymmetries there may arise something which implies risk and courage, but one may take the risk and one may collect the courage and dare to contradict. And one may claim a voice, and one may risk conflicts, and one may write petitions. That's something which is, for example, everywhere in early modern Europe, at least the right to write petitions. And it's clearly there in present-day China. There are no elections, but there is a very important force which is built into the right of petitions. And there are many forms of voice in social systems. And again, that's a very interesting form of balancing power imbalances by the invention and the rise and the courage to dare voice. There is a 6th strategy, which is somehow surprising, but which you often find in social systems. You can deal with power imbalances by constraint absorption. That's a term, as much as I see it, arose in organization theory. And what is meant by this term of constraint adoption is that somebody accepts the constraints one has, but builds the constraints into the social system in which one lives. A good example, and there is some writing and research on this, are economic mergers in which the weaker enterprise dares a takeover of the bigger enterprise. That's rare, but it happens, and it sometimes succeeds. You have to have some strategic advantage which allows a takeover of a big firm by a small firm. In Germany, some years ago, we had this very daring essay of Porsche to stage a takeover coup against Volkswagen. And they nearly had succeeded. There were some financial reporting irregularities, and because of this it collapsed. But it could have succeeded. And there are many other examples in social systems. I will only mention one, which is very important in historical terms. If you think of martyrs, a very prominent role figure in Christianity and in many other religions, what martyrs do is clearly a case of constraint adoption. They don't change the frame. They accept torture. They accept to be killed. It's more than that. They want torture. They want to be killed. They want the whole apparatus of power imbalance and the whole apparatus of physical force. They want this to be staged because they know if they provoke it and it happens, they will be the victors at the end. In the moment of their death, their power will be bigger than the power of the person. At least it may happen, it can happen that it is bigger. And that's a very interesting strategy of constraint absorption, which again you find in our days. Think of Islamic fundamentalists. They play the same game. They want to be martyrized because they know from this may arise such symbolic advantages, such a mobilization, which makes from them the winners. 7, gift exchange. That's again something which has often been described in social theory. I think we don't find it, at least the extreme cases, we don't find it any longer. But in the way Marcel Mauss, for example, described it, it's again a very interesting strategy of balances, power imbalances. You know what has to be done. You have to give something. And the richer you are, the more you have to give. There is a distributional aspect to it. In this respect, it's simply as long as you only look at the distributional aspect, and as long as you only say in a potlatch significant resources are destroyed. That's sometimes true, often it's not really true. But what is interesting that in this distribution of resources, at the same time, power is extended and is built up, because that is a paradox of the gift, which Mauss makes very clear. If I give something to someone, and especially if it's a big gift, and the gift of an important object, somehow this object will always stay with me. It will be in the life of the other, but the other has now to live his life or her life together with the object given by me. And from the object, the other is somehow controlled in his life. And that's the very interesting paradoxical aspect of gift exchange, which makes it so interesting as a somehow paradoxical way of balancing power imbalances. You seem to lose power, but by losing power you build up power. And that makes it such a prominent feature of many hunter-gatherer societies. Last point, obvious point, and therefore I need not make many remarks about it, socialization and education. If you look at societies into which very strong asymmetrical relationships and power imbalances are built into, it's a very important aspect of these societies that they understand socialization and education mainly as socialization into submission and subordination. And that means in some respects that's again a way of managing power imbalances. Now you are used to submission and subordination. Now submission and subordination is the object you appreciate most. You really want it. You really live for it in some respects. And therefore the structure changes by building the structures, by changing power imbalances in the way that's no longer foreign to the people who are forced into these power imbalances. It's not impressed on them with force, because they are socialized in a way that's the way they want to live. And that's, again, a very interesting strategy. That's my last point. I think, and that's my last remark, if we want to understand at some point in the career of the excellence cluster the structure of modernity, which is at least a society which exchanged preferences, exchanged the preference for submission and subordination for a preference toward equality and egalitarian social relations. If you want to understand if this can succeed, if this has succeeded, I think you will have to study the social history as the evolutionary trajectories related to these 8 strategies of balancing operations. I have not done this research, and we have not done this research, but that's clearly a way one should opt, as much as I understand, at some point to switch from the understanding of the universality of power imbalances in all human systems to a strange modern constellation which for the first time in history tries to build society not on the basis of power imbalances but on the basis of a preference for equality. Thank you.